It was almost 6 p.m. when Patrick Dunn finally got home on Wednesday night. He had worked an extra hour and a half to finish the wiring job he had been assigned that morning by Wayne Falk, his supervisor. By staying the extra time, he'd been able to complete the job almost half a day earlier than the estimate had allowed. Mind you, he'd worked like hell all day, and he could feel it in his sore muscles. It was almost good that his wife Glinda had left that morning for 3 days of seminars in Columbus. Originally, he had offered to take some time off and accompany her on the trip, but she had made quite an issue of it, reminding him that the two of them would be leaving on a cruise during the spring break. They had their tickets, and he had already booked some vacation time for the trip. The tickets were prominently displayed on the middle shelf of their china cabinet, situated so that they could see them any time they looked into their dining room. Patrick was a little surprised that there was no message on his answering machine to let him know that she had arrived okay. She had decided to make the approximately 3-hour drive rather than take one of the commuter jets that would have also been an option. If he recalled correctly, registration commenced at 7 p.m., so he decided to give her a quick call and press the speed dial button on their wall phone, the one that would connect him to her cell phone. It rang just twice before she answered. "I was just about to call you, Patrick. You must have read my mind." She sounded happy, and he could hear the buzz of a crowd around her as she spoke. He wasn't surprised that she knew he was on the phone, as her call display would have shown that the incoming call was made from her home phone. "You know I've always been able to read your mind, honey. So, you obviously made it there in one piece. How was the traffic? You still have all of the fenders on your car, I hope?" He chuckled loudly, knowing that her first words of reply would be a defense of her driving skills. He could imagine the look of exasperation upon her pretty face, and knew that if they were face to face she would have stuck her tongue out at him to let him know what she thought of his question. The fact that it was early January and a light snowfall had been possible had made him a bit concerned about her making the trip by car. He would have been happier if she had taken the flight instead. He was relieved that she had answered so quickly. She laughed before replying, "Of course it's all in one piece. The trip here was clear sailing all the way. Traffic was light and I had no problems finding the Sheraton Hotel. That map you printed off the internet helped a lot, honey. You know I'd do anything to help you, dear. Nothing is too good for my Glinda, I always say. In fact, I spoke to the boss this morning and he gladly agreed to give me the time off so I can join you there." "No, you're not coming here," she quickly replied, her voice an octave higher. She hesitated a few seconds and continued more calmly. "We already had this conversation, Patrick. You know I want to wait until spring break for us to take a trip away together." "Yeah, I know. I'm just pulling your chain, Glinda." I didn't speak to them about any time off. This had been his intended response, even before her emphatic rejection of the idea, but it bothered him that she was so forceful with her reply. "I'll stay home like a good little boy and do as I'm told." He laughed after saying that, as it wasn't in his nature to let her get her way so easily. He could tell there was a measure of relief in her voice when she said, "I'm glad to hear that, Patrick. This is just going to be a boring few days, and I've already selected a full schedule of seminars to attend. There wouldn't have been much time for us to do anything together while we were here. You said that I must have read your mind, Glinda. Did you want to talk to me about something?" "Oh, I'm glad you reminded me. I can't find my travel emergency bag. You know, the one with my sewing kit, the lint remover, and those other things. I was sure I packed it. Could you check the bedroom to see if I left it there? Maybe it's in the trunk of the car, if you don't see it there." "Sure thing, babe. Just hang on a minute, and I'll pick up the cordless phone in the bedroom." He laid the handset on the counter and quickly headed upstairs to their bedroom. He had only taken 2 steps into the room when he could see the case she was looking for sitting on the corner of the chest of drawers. He picked up the cordless phone and said, "Problem solved. The bag you're looking for is right here on the tall chest. You're just going to have to be careful and not lose any buttons, and stay away from lint." He laughed. "Oh, thank goodness it's there. I didn't want to have to make a trip all the way down to the parking garage to look for it. They have a small convenience store just off the lobby, and I can just buy whatever I need." She hesitated for a few seconds before continuing, "I should go soon, honey. They opened the registration desk early, and I'm third in line." She quickly continued, "I probably won't call much this week, as I'm signed into an evening presentation from 7:30 to 10 p.m. tomorrow night, and Friday night they have a fancy supper planned. I have my last seminar on Saturday morning, so I'll start for home right after lunch, and I'll be home in time to have supper with you, dear." "That's okay, honey. I worked extra tonight, and I could probably do that Thursday and Friday as well. Give me a call if you can. and I'll call if anything important comes up. I'll see you for supper on Saturday in any event." The two of them exchanged a few more pleasantries before ending their call. As Patrick headed back downstairs to hang up the wall phone, he started thinking about Glinda and her reaction to his joke about joining her. She had been behaving a bit strangely for several months now, sometimes too quiet, other times too anxious to please. Even when they had first seriously discussed the possibility of him accompanying her on this trip, her reaction had been an emphatic rejection of the idea. The realization that he was hungry diverted his thoughts from the consideration of Glinda's recent actions, so he decided to order a pizza. He had almost 40 minutes before the estimated delivery time, so he immediately headed upstairs to strip off his dirty work uniform and have a shower. When that was done, he dressed himself casually in a pair of jeans and one of his mini work t-shirts, all emblazoned with the corporate logo of Anderson Electric, his employer. He was relaxing at the kitchen table enjoying a beer when his pizza arrived. He knew he should have prepared himself a better supper, but being overweight was never a problem for him. His work kept him very fit. Glinda was not a big fan of pizza, so he felt comfortable indulging himself while she was away. He would have the leftovers the next day, packed for his lunch. Most workplaces had a microwave oven available where he could reheat his meal. He spent the next hour watching one of the news programs on TV, but he soon realized that his concentration on the talking head had lapsed, and he was once more thinking about Glinda and her change in demeanor over the last 60-some days. It bothered him that something was different with her, and that she had been so adamantly opposed to his joining her on her big trip. At 35, Glinda was a real beauty, tall and slim, with long dark hair and dark eyes. She was employed as a professor of sociology at the local college. She had just been accepted for tenure at the end of the previous school year, and was very proud of the fact that she had managed that. As one of the junior members of the faculty, she had more classes than most, but she did mention that she'd been given the services of a teaching assistant, or TA as she called it. When the fall semester began, she told him how nice it was that her TA, a senior who would be graduating in the spring, was available to do some of the marking and student advisement for which she had always been solely responsible. She had mentioned that his name was Anthony, but Patrick could not remember whether he had ever heard his last name. His name had come up a few times in the first couple of months, but she hadn't said anything about him in quite some time. In mid-November, she had brought up the subject of the upcoming seminars that she wanted to attend. They were scheduled for the off week between New Year's Day and the start of the second semester. It was considered professional development, and her college would pay most of the costs. Initially, when he had dropped the suggestion that maybe he could accompany her, she hadn't voiced any objection. 2 weeks later, though, she had made up her mind that she did not want him to go with her, suggesting instead that they take a trip during the spring break. Reluctantly, he had finally agreed with her emphatic decision. Little was said about the seminars over Christmas, and they had enjoyed the holiday, spending it with family and friends. He did notice a few big envelopes of registration and course material arrive, and that her registration was quickly mailed back. It seemed she was anxious to make the trip, and had even started packing her suitcase a couple of days before New Year's Day. Mind you, she was always organized, and this was not totally out of character for her. Just after 8 o'clock, he went back up to their bedroom, intending to continue reading the book he had left unfinished on the bedside table. When he got there and noticed the bag that Glinda had called about, he decided to put it back on the closet shelf where it was usually kept. When he picked it up, he noticed that it had been sitting on top of Glinda's diary, a book he thought she normally kept in her book bag. They had been married 8 years, but he had rarely seen her diary, as she kept it securely hidden away almost all of the time. He had made a joke of asking her to let him read it years earlier, just after they had been married, but she had absolutely refused, making him well aware of the fact that this was for her own private and personal use. She described it as being the same as her thoughts or her memory, and it was for her eyes only. They had never discussed it again, and in fact, he had only seen it open in her hands a couple of times during their 8 years of marriage. Both times he had caught her unawares, and the moment she had seen him, she had closed the book and snapped the little lock shut, effectively locking him out. Patrick suspected that she was making the entries into her diary while she was in her office at the college, although she could be doing it at home while he was away at work. Their schedules did not overlap exactly, and she was usually still at home when he left, and had returned by the time he would get off his shift. After returning the bag to the closet, he returned to the dresser and picked up the diary, the first time he had ever actually touched it. The book was about 6 inches by 8 inches and an inch thick. It was bound in red leather, and was kept securely closed by a hasp that was held in place by a small, brass-plated lock. As he held the book, it occurred to Patrick that it probably held the secret to Glinda's change in behavior over the last few months. Instead of putting the book back onto the dresser where it had been, he carried it downstairs with him as he returned to the kitchen. The light there was much brighter, and he carefully examined the book and its lock. One of the first things that he noticed was that when he examined the top and bottom of the book, he could see that only about a third of the pages appeared to have signs of use, while the rest seemed pristine. His first thought was that there was no way this one book could be the only diary that Glinda had. It was unlikely that 8 years of entries could only take a third of the book. He knew there must be other, older volumes. After thinking about it for a couple of minutes, Patrick realized that the only likely place that earlier diaries could be kept was in Glinda's closet. The two of them each had a closet, and he never went into hers. Even as he thought about it, he headed up the stairs to their bedroom. After 5 minutes of careful searching, he located a shoebox at the back of the top shelf, and when he opened it, he was rewarded with a stack of red leather diaries. He immediately returned to the kitchen with his trove. The first thing he noticed was that all of the diaries were identical. The ones in the box each had a little round white sticker on the spine, and the 6 books he found were numbered 1 to 6. The one that was presently in use was unnumbered. As he looked them over, he realized that each one was embossed on the bottom of the back cover with the name Coombs, and he recognized that as the name of a local specialty store. The next thing that he noticed was that the 7 locks appeared to be identical, with no identifying numbers or marks on any of them. He wondered if they were all keyed alike. Another thought quickly came to mind, and he immediately turned to the shelf below the phone and grabbed the phone book. In just a few seconds, he located the phone number for Coombs Specialties. It was already 25 minutes to 9, and he wondered if they would be open, as many of the stores in the downtown area stayed open late on Wednesday nights. The phone was answered after just 2 rings. Coombs Specialties, how may I help you? The voice was that of a young woman, and she sounded sincere with her question. Hello. I understand you sell a line of red leather diaries, about 6 inches by 8 inches in size. Do you know if you have any in stock right now? I'd like to get one as a gift. I think I know which book you're talking about. Just hold, and I'll go check to see if there are any on the shelf. She was gone from the phone for about 3 minutes before returning to say, yes, we have 2 in stock. After determining that the store was going to be open until 10 p.m., Patrick quickly left to get a look at one of the new diaries, one that he could perhaps use as a source to obtain the little key that opened them up. It was a long shot, but he knew that if he tried to pick one of the locks open, he would likely ruin it, and Glinda would probably never let him live down the fact that he had tried to snoop in her diaries. In just over half an hour, Patrick was on his way home again, with one of the red leather diaries with its key in the bag beside him. It was expensive, almost $60, but he wasn't concerned about the price. It was a small price to pay if he was able to find out what was bothering his wife. He could always use the new diary as a birthday gift for her. He already had visions of her keeping an illness from him. She had done that once before when a pap test had come up with abnormal results, and she had bottled up the worry she was going through instead of sharing it with him. It had ended up being nothing to be concerned about, but knowing that she had been in for a mammogram in the fall was in the back of his mind. The other thing that he thought might be causing her concern was the infighting that went on amongst the faculty members of the college. He knew that if she were having trouble with a colleague, she would never mention it to him. Glinda believed in looking after her own problems and decisions when it came to her job. There was another possibility, of course. It was there in the back of his mind, and he was consciously trying to ignore it, but it kept peeking into his thought processes. What if she was having an affair? Like any trusting husband, he could not bring himself to acknowledge that idea, and instead he concentrated on the other potential explanations. In some ways, they were an unlikely couple. He was an inch shorter than she was, with blonde, closely cropped hair and blue eyes. His was a muscular frame, while she was tall and slender. They had known each other in high school and had even dated a couple of times. After high school, they had gone their separate ways, with Patrick entering the electrical trade as an apprentice and Glinda going on to college and graduate school. They had reconnected by chance early during her last year, when both were invited to the birthday party of a mutual friend. They had clicked immediately and were married a month after she had finished her education. He was a master electrician by that time and had a small house on which he had recently made the down payment. That house was home to them for the first 5 years of their marriage, but with Glinda now making a good salary and Patrick holding a full-time job, they had eventually decided to move into a larger home. They had already discussed having a child, or maybe two, and had decided on the end of the school year as the target date for Glinda to stop using the birth control pills she had taken throughout their marriage. When he arrived back at home, Patrick wasn't 100% certain that the key for the new diary he had purchased would work with the locks on the diaries he had found. The key, stored in a small brown envelope within the box that held the diary, looked very small to him. He was beginning to think that perhaps he should have just asked the clerk whether the locks were all keyed alike. He had already made up his mind that if the key didn't work, he would forget about the whole thing. If each lock was keyed differently, he wasn't going to spend time searching the house for Glinda's hidden cache of diary keys. In any event, 5 minutes after he walked in the door, he was seated at the kitchen table with a stack of diaries and an open can of Coke in front of him. The little key was in his right hand, and he was staring at the 7th diary, the one that contained Glinda's most recent entries. He knew that if he tried that key, and it worked, there would be no going back. He would open her diary and read the things that she had made clear were meant to be private and personal to her alone. He sat there for what seemed like several minutes trying to decide whether he wanted to cross that line. He was worried that he would somehow accidentally let her know that he had snooped, and that she would never trust him again. In the end, his concerns about her health and the constant prodding of that unspoken question in the back of his mind combined to give him the push he needed to open the lock. The key fit precisely, turned smoothly, and the lock snapped open. Within seconds, the book was his to explore, and he had opened it to the last page Glinda had used. At the top of the page was the previous day's date, and about 3/4 of the page had been used. He quickly began reading the neat script written on the page. It took him about a minute to read the lines, and by the time he had finished he had paled, his face had lost all expression, and his eyes had taken on that shiny appearance that tears create. He got up slowly, picked up his can of Coke, and walked to the kitchen sink. As he stood there looking blankly out of the kitchen window, he slowly crushed the can of Coke, apparently not noticing that the beverage soon began to overflow the open can before running over his hand and into the sink. Eventually, he did notice his wet and sticky hand, dropped the crushed can into the sink, and rinsed the mess from his fingers. After drying his hands on a paper towel, he picked up the stack of diaries, along with the key, and walked slowly into the living room. He placed the stack of books on the end table beside his reclining chair, turned on the lamp that hung over it, and then sat back in his favorite chair. Once he was comfortable, he picked up the unnumbered 7th diary and opened it at the first page. He had a very clear idea of how the story was going to end. Now he needed to find out how it had begun. The page he had read had forever altered his picture of his perfect wife and their perfect life together. He needed to know the details of how that had happened, and he hoped the diary would provide them. Instead of reading the events in reverse order, he chose their chronological order. For a while, he had considered driving straight to the Sheraton Hotel, going up to room 412, and having it out with his wife. He quickly decided that doing so would likely be a recipe for disaster, as either he would be a prime candidate for a traffic accident in his haste to get there, or he would be unable to control himself if he did make the trip in one piece. His only other option would have been to phone her, but he was afraid he would have broken down when he heard her voice, and he was too much of a man to want to wimp out that way. The top of the first page was dated from early June, just over 6 months earlier. He began to read it, carefully looking for anything that might relate to the devastating information that Glinda had written on the last page. None of the entries covering the summer months contained anything that could help him understand his wife and the plans that she had made. There were several mentions of her happiness with her life, her husband, and the way her career had taken off in the time since she had been accepted for tenure. Everything he read should have made him happy and proud, confident in his marriage, but he knew how the story would end when he got to the final page. That knowledge soured every good thing he read. In early September, Glinda finally made an entry to her diary that included something that was related to what Patrick was looking for. He sat up in the chair and reread the pertinent portion of the entry twice. September 8th. Dear Diary, my new teaching assistant stopped by my office today. He is a little taller than I am, maybe an inch or so, and has black hair, dark eyes, and a short scruffy beard, more of an unshaven look. He introduced himself as Anthony Romano, and he reminds me of someone, a movie star maybe. He left me a printout of his marks, and he seems well qualified. Patrick began reading the diary more carefully now, looking for any other mentions of Anthony Romano, the teaching assistant. There was nothing in the next 2 entries, which contained only thoughts about her classes and how they seemed to be going. It seemed that she was quite content, although perhaps a bit nervous about how she would handle one of the large classes that she had. There were over 100 students in it, and she wondered how she would be able to accommodate that many. September 15th. Dear Diary, Anthony is now helping me with my large class. He takes questions from the students when I get busy setting up materials for my lecture. I noticed that my female students seem quite taken by him. I heard two of them discussing him as they left the class, mentioning that he looked a lot like Leonardo DiCaprio. That must be why he seemed familiar to me. As he continued reading, the mentions of Anthony Romano became more frequent. He was reading even more carefully now, pausing at times to reread certain passages. September 20th. Dear Diary, the classes are settling down now. A couple of students dropped out. I think they may have felt the course would be too difficult for them. I noticed that as I give my lectures, Anthony finds himself a seat in one of the front rows where he seems to spend all of his time watching me. I'll have to give him more work to do. September 24th. Dear Diary, I had about 3 hours clear this afternoon and was working on setting some reading assignments when Anthony came by my office. He stayed to help, and the job went quickly with both of us making copies and selecting articles to include. The entry continued with a long paragraph in which he mentioned her intention to talk to Patrick about where children might fit into their future. It was the first entry he had found that mentioned that subject. September 30th. Dear Diary, I caught Anthony staring at me again during a lecture. I looked at him and frowned, and I'm sure he knew what I meant by that, but he just grinned and continued watching me. At the end of every class, he is approached by at least a couple of the female students who ask him questions about the lecture. None of them seems to want to come to me for information. I'm guessing they're more interested in him than getting help. Overall, my students seem to be doing well, which pleases me greatly. It's not like I haven't lectured before, but now that I'm a full professor, I feel more pressure to have my students succeed. There were several entries in a row with no mention of Anthony, although they did show that her classes seemed to be proceeding very well. She was happy and upbeat in all of the entries, and mentioned her firm decision to talk to Patrick about their plans. He remembered that it was sometime in the fall when they had their first long talk about their shared desire to have at least one child. Glenda wanted to finish her first year as a full professor without the concerns and responsibilities of a pregnancy, so they decided to wait until the end of the school year to begin trying to conceive. October 8th. Dear Diary, I'm so excited. Patrick and I have made a commitment to have children, and I'm planning to go off the pill as soon as the spring semester ends. I mentioned all of this to Anthony, and he seems so happy for us. We were in my office, and he came over to where I was sitting behind my desk, took my hand and pulled me up to my feet, and then gave me a very big hug. He caught me by surprise, and when he didn't seem anxious to let me go, I had to push him back gently and remind him that my office door was open and anyone could walk by. October 10th. Dear Diary, Anthony came by my office this afternoon, and I have to admit that I'm a bit concerned. I didn't see him come in and didn't realize he was there until I heard the door close and lock. When I looked up at him, he was smiling at me and said, "Now no one can walk by and see us." I told him clearly to open the door, and he did. He hung around for about 15 minutes before he finally left. Now I'm wondering what he intended when he locked the door. October 11th. Dear Diary, I was preparing questions for a quiz for my first-year class when Anthony dropped in today. He stayed to help, and it really made the job easier. He apologized for closing the door yesterday, and I told him it was okay. When I asked him why he seemed so interested in me, he said that he enjoyed the company of mature women much more than girls his age. I told him I was happily married, but I have to admit that I found what he said very flattering. To think he would potentially be more interested in me than in some of the sexy young women in our college stirs me in ways that I find surprising. October 13th. Dear Diary, I expected Anthony to stop by my office today, but he didn't. I was a little disappointed, as I wanted to talk with him some more about what he said about being interested in mature women. October 15th. Dear Diary, there were a number of students in my office today when Anthony came in. I was hoping he would hang around until the last one left, but he was gone when I finished discussing essay topics with the last group. October 16th. Dear Diary, today I finally got a chance to speak with Anthony. He asked if he could close the door so we wouldn't be disturbed, and I went along with it. I was able to ask him about why he found mature women more interesting, and he said his first sexual experiences had been with a 40-year-old widow who lived next door to him. He claims he finds girls his age don't know what they want, not like a mature woman. I was standing, leaning against my desk, and while he was talking, he walked over to me. Before I had any time to think about it, he put his arms around me and pulled me to him. He was very gentle and it felt quite good. If I had ever had doubts about him finding me attractive, the fact that I could feel his hard erection pressing against my thigh dispelled them. I wanted to show him that I wasn't angry with him, so I let him hold me for almost a minute before I gently pushed back against him. He immediately released me, but caught me completely by surprise when he leaned forward and kissed me on the lips. It was a very short kiss, and he stepped back before I could break the kiss myself. He turned and left my office without either of us saying anything. I realized now that I should have called him on his actions and told him again that I'm a happily married woman. I didn't though, and now I find myself reliving the moment whenever I let my mind wander. Patrick was disturbed by this entry, as it showed him that while Anthony was continually pushing the envelope, Glenda was not responding in a way that he felt was appropriate. He left the book open on his chair while he went to get himself a fresh can of Coke. He was soon back in his chair with the book in his hands, prepared to continue reading about the apparent seduction of his wife. October 20th. Dear Diary. Late this afternoon, just before I was going to leave my office and go home, Anthony appeared in the doorway and asked me if I was busy. As soon as I said that I wasn't, he came in and locked the door behind him. He ignored me completely when I asked him to open the door, and instead he came straight to me. He took my hands in his and said that he'd been thinking of me constantly over the last 4 days. He said he wanted another kiss, a longer one. I told him that I wasn't a widow looking for a lover, and that it was improper for him to be pursuing me this way. He said he understood, but asked again for a kiss, saying it would be in celebration of his birthday. I thought it would be the easiest way to get rid of him, so I agreed, and I'm wishing now that I hadn't. The kiss lasted about a minute, and I have to admit it got pretty steamy. He finally broke the kiss. I know it should have been me to do that. I didn't know what to say, so I apologized for not having a birthday card I could give him. He smiled and said that it was okay. His birthday had been in July. I should have been mad at him for conning me, but all I could do was laugh at his trick to get me to kiss him. He thanked me for the wonderful kiss and then left my office. I don't know what it is about him, but I'm afraid he may be getting to me. I'll have to be more careful around him in the future. The next 3 entries made no mention of Anthony. Glenda was kept busy correcting a small test she had given her largest class and marking the essays her students had submitted. Patrick found it odd that Anthony wasn't involved in these 2 tasks, but there was no clue in the diary entries as to why he wasn't. October 30th. Dear Diary. For the first time, I'm at a loss on how to tell you about my life. I guess the only thing I can do is describe what happened today. I don't know how I will be able to handle facing Patrick when he gets home, as I'm afraid that he'll be able to take one look at me and know what happened. It all started when Anthony walked into my office this afternoon. I was busy reading and didn't hear him walk in, and he surprised me with his cheerful hello. When I looked up, he was closing and locking my office door. For some reason, I didn't say a word to him about that. When he got to my desk, he reached down and gently took my hands and pulled me up beside him. He didn't give me a chance to say a word before he took me in his arms and began to kiss me. I'm so ashamed. There is no excuse for me not putting an end to it the moment it started, but it was as though he had turned on a switch inside of me. Within seconds, I was returning his kiss, and I got into it so much that at first I almost didn't realize he had brought his hands from around my back and had begun to gently massage my body. As soon as I realized what he was doing, I pushed him away and broke the kiss. He just smiled and said, "Don't even try to suggest that you didn't enjoy that." I didn't say anything right away, and he said, "I knew it." When I finally found my voice, I told him to leave. He gave me a sly smile and said he'd see me tomorrow. I realized that I'm not handling this situation with Anthony properly. He's making it so hard on me, and I'm sure he knows it. Maybe I should talk to Patrick about it, but I just know that he wouldn't be too happy with the way I've let things develop. The worst part is that I find myself thinking about Anthony from time to time and how I could feel his erection pressing against me again today. The entire entry for the day was this description of how Anthony had felt up his wife, and when he finished reading it for the 3rd time, Patrick realized that he was once again angry enough to have lost control if Anthony had been in front of him. He had never thought he was capable of extreme violence until that moment. November 2nd. Dear Diary. I think I have finally got past worrying about how I would react in front of Patrick. That first night was the hardest. Every time I spoke to Patrick or he looked at me, I was sure that he was going to figure out what had happened in my office. At one point, he asked if something was bothering me, as I guess I was behaving a little abnormally under the pressure. He accepted my denial without question, and I found myself thinking of how easily I had been able to hide things from my husband. I hope I never have to do it again. November 6th. Dear Diary. It has been a few days since I last saw Anthony in private. He has been at the classes where he is contracted to assist me, and I notice that he is still staring at me. When he catches my eye, he grins at me, and I know I blushed the first couple of times that happened. I find myself wondering how I'll handle it the next time he shows up in my office alone. November 8th. Dear Diary, Anthony dropped into my office this afternoon, but there were a couple of other students already there. I happened to look up as he turned to leave, and he threw me a kiss and then grinned at me. I'm sure the other students didn't see it as they were both standing with their backs to him, but I wish he would be more considerate of my position. I received an invitation to attend a series of seminars in Columbus just after the new year. It looks interesting, and I think I will attend if I can. I ordered the information package. November 9th. Dear Diary, yesterday was another day that is going to be very difficult to write about. Once again, I am very unhappy with both Anthony's and my own behavior, and I'm wondering where all of this will end up if I don't do something about it soon. In the morning, I had a couple of hours free, and I was hard at work when I heard the office door close and lock. I don't know how Anthony can sneak in like that, without me knowing. I asked him to open it, but he just ignored me. When he tried to pull me up from my seat, I resisted. Unfortunately, my resistance faded away as he kept it up. I thought, what harm can another little kiss do? If only that was all of it. There is no doubt that Anthony has mastered the art of kissing. It seemed like he was totally in command of my senses, not to mention my common sense, within just a few seconds. At the same time as he was switching his lips from mine to the sensitive spots on my neck, I felt his hands slide up and start exploring my body. There is no denying that I really got into the moment and was really enjoying what he was doing to me. It was unbelievable how quickly he had me aroused. I've always enjoyed kissing, and the way he was teasing me marvelously. If I had had the good sense to limit it to that, it wouldn't be so difficult to write this all down. I can't say that I didn't notice what he was doing, but it's also true that I just couldn't stop him or myself. I felt his right hand leave, and then I knew he was fumbling with the button and zipper on my slacks. I didn't do anything to stop him, and within a few more seconds, he was sliding his hand and started exploring my lower body. It was too late for me to stop him, as I was already into the early stages of enjoyment. His kisses, the wonderful way he was caressing my body with one hand, and the gentle movement of his other hand, I've had in quite a while. As soon as I was back in control of myself, I pushed him away and ran into the bathroom. There were tears in my eyes as I was straightening up my clothes to their normal state. All I could think of was how angry Patrick would be if he had seen us or if he ever found out about this. Just as I finished getting my slacks done up, Anthony walked into the doorway of the bathroom. He was sucking on the middle finger of his right hand, and as soon as I looked at him, he removed it and said that I tasted wonderful. I guess he could see that I was very upset, and he left as soon as he said that he wasn't going to apologize and that he hoped we could do that again. I should have told him to not even think such a thing, but I was upset and didn't regain my voice until after he was gone. The thing that really surprised me was how well I was able to handle myself in front of Patrick when he got home from work. I'm certain that he didn't suspect a thing, and I could hardly believe that I didn't feel under any strain as we talked over the course of the evening. Last night we made love, and it was as good as it has ever been. I think that maybe I was still feeling the effects of my high state of arousal from the morning. Either that or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that Anthony doesn't hold a candle to Patrick in the lovemaking department. Once again, the whole day's entry centered on an episode with Anthony, and Patrick found himself reading it repeatedly as his anger once again grew. Finally, he turned the page and continued reading Glenda's diary. For a full week, there was no mention at all of Anthony or anything related to the developing relationship between Glenda and her TA. In fact, Patrick noticed a definite sense of contentment in her entries. November 17th. Dear Diary, God, I just don't know what is wrong with me. Anthony has developed a hold on me that I would never have imagined possible. I don't know whether it's his rugged good looks or some defect in me, but I just can't seem to maintain control around him. This afternoon, he came into my office and sat on the corner of my desk. I told him we were going to have to talk about what happened the last time he was there, and he quickly agreed. He just watched me and smiled as I told him how wrong it was for us to be involved in any way. I reminded him that I was happily married, and that my position as a professor could be jeopardized if anyone were to find out what we had done. As I spoke, he just nodded and smiled at me. When I was finished speaking, I leaned back in my chair, confident that he understood my position. In spite of my reasoned approach and my confidence that the situation had been resolved, I found myself getting aroused just watching him sitting there smiling at me. I know I was thinking about the sensation of his fingers as they caressed my body. After what seemed like several minutes, but was really only perhaps 40 seconds, he asked me whether I wanted to lock the door, or should he. I couldn't find my voice, and after waiting just a few seconds he got up, closed, and locked the door to my office. When he walked back to my desk, he asked me to join him on the small leather sofa in front of my bookcase. I can't think of words to explain why I went along with his request. We began kissing, really getting our tongues involved in it. After a minute or so, when he hadn't brought his hand to my upper body, I was so anxious for the wonderful sensations he could evoke in me that I took one of his hands and brought it to my jugs. That signal seemed to turn him on. After several minutes of kissing my lips and caressing me, he moved his head down so that he could kiss and nip at my jugs. It felt glorious. When he moved one of his hands to bring it up under my skirt, I moved my knees apart to let him do it. I helped by raising my bum from the sofa. I was shameless in my actions, but I just couldn't help myself. He soon had his hand and fingers bringing me the most amazing sensations as he caressed me, and then one of his fingers found my G-spot. I had a wonderful sex as I humped up against his hand and fingers. When I calmed down, after that, we kissed, and I could taste myself on his lips. As we kissed, he was quite apparently handsome and has better than Patrick's in terms of seduction. It was so hot and hard. As I stroked him, he reached over for a box of tissues and pulled off 3 or 4 of them. When he handed them to me, I knew what he wanted. After he pulled up his pants when he came, I got my clothes back into place and met him at the door to the bathroom as he was leaving it. We shared a quick kiss before he said thank you and left. We've entered dangerous territory, and I just don't know what I'm going to do about it. A large part of me wants to terminate his position as my TA, but another part of me says that we haven't done anything that bad. I could never tell Patrick about this, and fortunately, there's no way that he will ever find out about it. My office is on the 4th floor, with no facing buildings, so no one can see us. All of this happened only an hour ago, and I can still feel the afterglow from my orgasm. I hope my emotions are back to normal before I go home to Patrick. This was another difficult entry for Patrick to read, as it was plain that the situation had escalated quickly. He was already feeling that he certainly didn't know his wife as well as he thought he did, and had already decided to read all of her diaries no matter how long it would take. He went back and reread the 2 pages over again. When he was finished, he looked up and happened to notice that it was already 2 o'clock in the morning. He knew there were still quite a few pages to go, but there was no way that he could put the book aside. Before he began reading again, he phoned the office number at Anderson Electric and left a message on the voicemail that he would be off the next day for personal reasons. He hadn't made any final decisions yet on what he would do, but he knew that his life was already forever changed. Where he had once held love and dreams for the future, there was only a cold emptiness and a building anger now. Before he continued with the diary, he visited the bathroom to eliminate the last can of Coke, and then picked up a fresh can on his way back to the living room. He wasn't tired, and he didn't think it was the caffeine in his soft drink that was keeping him awake. His mind was in overdrive, trying to digest everything he had read. He looked at the clock again, and marveled that it was only 8 hours ago that he had talked to Glinda and had his suspicions aroused. November 22nd. Dear Diary, Anthony was in the office this afternoon, and I made sure that I kept the desk between us. He didn't push the issue and made no attempt to lock the door. I felt so guilty for the last few days that there's no way I would have ever agreed for him to even touch me. I think he could feel my firm intent to keep things between us at their proper level. I hope I can maintain this resolve. The next few days of entries continued with no mention of Anthony. He could tell that Glinda was upbeat as the first semester was ending. There were only a couple of weeks left, and she sounded anxious for them to be over. November 23rd. Dear Diary, I told Patrick about the seminars, and he's okay with me attending. He even suggested that he might take some time off to go with me. I will have to think about that. There might be a few things we could do when I'm not attending sessions. It was obvious to Patrick that Glinda's decision about him accompanying her to the seminars had made a complete about-face between the 23rd of November and the middle of December. He continued reading. November 25th. Dear Diary, Anthony was in the office this afternoon, asking me if he could drop by my home. I told him clearly that that was never going to happen. He particularly wanted to know if Patrick ever worked out of town overnight. His next idea was that I should visit him at the house on 2nd Avenue that he shared with 3 other students. When I told him that there was no way I was going to do that, he told me that I could always call him if I changed my mind. His name and number were in the telephone book. Other than trying to convince me to meet him away from the college, he was on his best behavior. I told him about the seminars I was planning on attending, and he seemed quite interested in them. I told him they were for teaching staff only, but he just sort of smiled. November 30th. Dear Diary, yesterday was another day that I'm going to have great difficulty telling you about. I feel like I have completely lost my way. I hardly slept last night, and even Patrick seemed to know that something was wrong. How I wish I could have explained to him what was on my mind, but that is just impossible. The last couple of days I had several daydreams about Anthony and our mutual gratification session. I don't have any affection for him, but I just can't seem to close my mind to him and what we've done together. This is where my thoughts were when he came into my office early in the afternoon. I was preparing exam material, and he helped me get it finished in about half an hour. After I had thanked him, he simply stated that he was going to lock the door. What is wrong with me that I couldn't stop him from doing that? I just stood there and watched while he closed and locked the door. When he came back, he led me to the sofa, and then we stood there and kissed. He was lying me back on the sofa. The next thing I knew, he was putting on a condom. I was so turned on from the moment that we started kissing that I couldn't even imagine saying no to him. The whole time that we had sex on the sofa, my mind was telling me to stop, but it simply couldn't defeat the lust that was controlling me. When we both came, and it was over, I grabbed my clothes and ran into the bathroom. I locked the door and got dressed while I cried. How could I have let this happen? Anthony had dressed and was gone when I finally came out of the bathroom. Everything in my office was as it had been before this happened, and I remember I wondered what he had done with the condom. I spent the rest of the afternoon at my desk with the door locked, alternately crying and thinking, trying to figure out how this had happened. Maybe I should consider seeing a therapist. While Patrick could see that there was honest regret and distress in Glinda's words, he couldn't find justification for why it had happened, the act that she had obviously been a willing participant in. His heart was growing darker the more that he read, and the words he was reading were having a very negative effect on his normally generous and happy personality. The Patrick that was emerging was not someone that any of his friends, relatives, or even Glinda would recognize. December 3rd. Dear Diary, Anthony stopped me in the hall this morning and asked me if I would reconsider meeting him at the house he shared. He said that he wanted to spend several hours with me in a real bed. I told him to forget it, that I would never consider meeting him, especially at some location where I could be seen. I reminded him again about my husband and my career. Once he seemed to accept what I had said, he quietly made another suggestion to me. He asked if it was possible that he could accompany me to my seminars in January. He had seen my brochure from the Sheraton Hotel that was hosting the group and said that a group of sociology professors wouldn't have the whole place booked up. He said he was willing to pay for his own room there if I would agree to spend the nights with him. I told him to forget it. Just before he left, he smiled at me and said that I should think about it. I didn't say anything to him, but the thought was already in the back of my mind. What is wrong with me? Patrick had to take a break at this point, as the anger he felt at the two of them was beginning to boil over. He paced back and forth in the living room several times before heading to the kitchen for another can of Coke. He was tempted to have a few beers instead, but decided to keep a clear head. He was in a state where he already knew what he would like to do, but he had no plan, and he knew he would have to have a proper plan. He went back to the living room and the open diary. December 7th. Dear Diary, Anthony stopped by my office for a minute this morning to say goodbye. He is going to be flying home for Christmas after his exam tomorrow. He wanted to know if he should come back early so that he could go to the seminar with me. He said he knew that I was considering it. To put him off, I told him to call me in a few days, that I hadn't made up my mind about it. He smiled and said that he would call me in a couple of days at my office. December 8th. Dear Diary, I can't understand why I'm considering this. I'm so happy with Patrick and our life together. I never think of Anthony in any terms except as a sexual partner. There's definitely no love there. It would be somewhat nice to be able to spend some unhurried time with him, as he is definitely an experienced lover. I wonder if he will call me or give up on the idea. December 12th. Dear Diary, Anthony called me at my office this morning. He still wants me to take him with me to Columbus. He suggested that I phone them and make a reservation for 2 connecting rooms, so that no one will ever see us entering the same room. His idea that I describe him as my brother and reserve the room in his name sounds foolproof. He said he would call me again tomorrow to see if I had made the arrangements, and if so, he would call them to put his room on his own credit card. Now I have to make up my mind whether I'm going to consciously plan to cheat on Patrick. December 14th. Dear Diary, Anthony called again today. Apparently, he tried to reach me yesterday, but I wasn't in my office. I did call and make the arrangements that he suggested. I felt so bad as I did it. They gave us rooms 412 and 414. He is going to call and put room 414 on his visa today. He sounds excited. I can't say that I'm actually excited, but I think I am looking forward to this. I don't know what it is about Anthony that turns me on this way. There have been many handsome men who have looked me over in the past, but I've never been tempted before. I think he may be one of those guys who just naturally know how to press all the right buttons. It certainly seems that way with me, anyway. God, I hope Patrick never finds out about this. It would kill him. He doesn't deserve this at all. There were a number of entries for the remainder of the month of December, but only one of them mentioned Anthony or the plan that he and Glinda had made to spend 3 nights at the Sheraton. Apparently, he had phoned her at their home 2 days after Christmas. December 28th. Dear Diary, Anthony called me at home yesterday. I was shocked to hear his voice, but I was also thankful that Patrick had to work. Anthony said that he was prepared for a man to answer the phone and would have asked for a girl named Veronica if that had happened. He said he just wanted to be sure I was still going to go through with it, as he would have to fly back New Year's Day if he was going to be driving with me. I told him that I was going to take him with me, and he really got excited. I tried to sound calm about it, but inside I have to admit that I was getting excited too. I really expect this to get him out of my system. Before Patrick and I were married, I never spent even 2 nights in a row with the same man. I've been thinking about that, and maybe this is the reason that I've decided to go along with Anthony's suggestion that we spend this time together. I just pray that this gets whatever it is out of my system. Patrick looked up at the clock and saw that I was almost 5 a.m. He knew that the next entry was the one that he had read first, just moments after he had unlocked the diary. He was almost finished the most recent book of Glinda's diaries, but he had already decided that he had to read all of them. Even though what he had read suggested that she had never cheated on him before, he had to know that for certain. He wanted to know if there was someone else on whom he could spread his anger. He already knew that there were things he was going to have to do today. So before he finished the last page, he went back to the kitchen to prepare a pot of coffee. There would be time to sleep later in the day. When he had a cup of fresh coffee in his hand, he returned to the living room to reread the last page of the book. January 3rd. Dear Diary, well, tomorrow is the big day. I'm off to 3 days of seminars and 3 nights of sex with Anthony. I'll be picking him up before I leave town, and I guess I'll drop him off at his home on the way back into town. Thank goodness that Patrick hasn't seriously tried to convince me to let him come along on this trip. I really don't know what I would say to him if he did that. Patrick got me a map from the internet so that I won't get lost driving there. This afternoon, while he was at work, I checked on the internet and found that there is a Victoria's Secret store in the mall next to the Sheraton. I think I'll get a couple of really sexy outfits to wear with Anthony, and I can always rinse them out before I come back, so that I can wear them for Patrick. I don't really like the thought of doing that, but he will never know. I forgot to mention to Anthony that he had better have a good supply of condoms, as I don't intend to take any chances on bringing home a surprise for Patrick. If he doesn't have any with him, we can always stop at a pharmacy. There is bound to be one at the mall with the lingerie shop. I think we'll stop there before we check in. I can't believe that I'm getting so excited about this trip. I'm also wondering if Anthony will expect me to do things that Patrick and I have never tried. I'm not sure that I would like to have that happen, as it would be difficult to suggest something new to Patrick right out of the blue. He might wonder where I got the idea. Maybe if that comes up, I'll save anything I learned for our cruise, as I can always say that I'm just being adventurous. I've already started packing, and I hope that Patrick doesn't think that's suspicious. The last thing that I want to do is make him suspect anything. I just read all of my thoughts for today, and I wonder if I can really go through with this. What happened in my office was very spur of the moment. If Anthony and I spend even 1 night together on this trip, it will have been planned well in advance. There is no way I could ever excuse it, even to myself, as a moment of weakness. I guess I could still tell Anthony that I'm backing out, and I could pay for his room and expenses for the trip. Right now, though, that probably won't be a problem. I've been getting wet just thinking about it. Patrick finished the 7th diary and sat there drinking his coffee as he went over all of details he had been reading over the previous 9 hours. As he sat there, he began to put together a plan, something that he could work on over the next 3 days. He had already made up his mind that his marriage was over. Even if she backed out of her agreement with Anthony, he could never trust her again. Even the thought of forgiving her seemed hopelessly out of the question. As the hours had passed, he had been able to feel his love for Glinda seeping away, while at the same time, his hatred for Anthony was building exponentially. Just before noon, Patrick got up from his computer and went to get his cordless phone. Once he had retrieved it, he sat down again at the computer and dialed a number from the screen. Pearsall Investigations, how may I help you? The woman who answered the call sounded very businesslike, and Patrick noticed that right away. Do you do divorce work? Patrick wasn't sure what he should call the work he wanted done, but assumed that it would normally be related to divorces. If you mean do we get photos of cheating spouses and that sort of thing, the answer is yes. Would you like to speak to an investigator? The woman's professional demeanor showed through, and Patrick now felt comfortable. Yes, I would like to speak to someone. That's the type of work I would like to get done. The phone switched over to a soft rock station while Patrick waited for almost 30 seconds before the investigator answered the phone. John Pearsall speaking. I understand you're looking for some evidence for a divorce. How can I help you? The man sounded very businesslike as well, and Patrick immediately proceeded to tell him his story. Well, I think my wife is having an affair with a man at the Sheraton Hotel near the airport. I'd like to know if you'd be able to get me some photographic proof, and I'd like to know how much it would cost. Patrick wasn't too sure what he needed to know, or exactly how he would get his request across. The Sheraton, you say? We could definitely handle that. Is this going on now? What time frame are we talking about here? Patrick was comfortable now and said, My wife is there now. She's staying until Saturday morning. She's in room 412, and the man she's meeting is in 414. They're connecting rooms. They were there last night as well, but I hadn't decided what I should do until this morning. My wife is attending a series of seminars, and the guy she's seeing came along for the ride. He wondered if the investigator would catch the unintended double entendre. John Pearsall must have caught the joke, as he chuckled before saying, I'll need a few more details, and I'd like to know what kind of surveillance you would like. First, could you give me their names and descriptions? Patrick described his wife and offered to send a photo by email if it was required. He had found the firm by locating their website, but didn't want to waste time corresponding by email. He also told him Anthony's full name and gave him the vague description from his wife's diary. This is fairly straightforward, Mr. Dunn. We can get cameras into their rooms this afternoon and leave them there until the weekend, after they check out. Getting the equipment installed only takes a few minutes, and I just checked my files on the Sheraton. We have a contact there that will let us into the rooms at a flat rate for each entry. If you aren't going to require us to follow them, there won't be an hourly charge for our services. I think a flat fee of $800 will cover it, if all you're after is photographic proof. You said cameras. Would it be much cheaper with only one? I just want confirmation that they have been together. In fact, I'd only want to check on them tonight. If there are photos to prove they are spending the night together, I'd like to get them by late tomorrow afternoon. Patrick had not thought about the details and what would be required, and wasn't sure what to ask. We don't know which room they will use, so we have to put cameras in both of them. The cost is reasonable, considering the high quality of the equipment we use and the out-of-pocket expenses we have. Paying a member of the maintenance staff to let us into the two rooms twice, once to install the equipment and once to remove it, will cost us $100. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. I've never had to do this before. I assume you'll want payment in advance. I'll make payment by credit card on your website, if that's okay. Patrick was determined now to just get things arranged. The man he was dealing with sounded like a professional, and he didn't want to have to travel all the way up there to meet him personally. Using the website will be fine. When you fill in the form, use case number 1372A. It will help our accountants keep things straight. As soon as I see your payment, I'll head over to install the cameras. We'll be creating a DVD of whatever we capture on the cameras. I'll need your name and address to forward them to. It seemed simple to Patrick, but having the DVD mailed to him wouldn't be of much help. Could you just hang on to the DVD until I contact you? What I need right now are some photos to prove to me that they really are meeting there. I don't want anything explicit, just some photos that make it clear that they are having an affair. You could email them to me tomorrow, and I'll print them out here. You're the boss, Mr. Dunn. I can easily take still photos from the video streams. The DVD can stay in your file until you request it. Patrick supplied his telephone number and made his credit card payment while they were still on the line to each other. With the confirmation of payment made, the investigator promised to get right at the installation of the cameras. Satisfied with the arrangements he'd made with the private investigator, Patrick finally succumbed to the lack of sleep that he had been enduring. He stretched out on the sofa and was soon asleep. By late afternoon, he awoke, somewhat refreshed, but definitely hungry. After eating the warmed-over pizza, he went back to his chair, unlocked the first of the 6 completed diaries, and began reading. It went much quicker now, because he wasn't rereading anything, nor was he spending a lot of time thinking about the contents. He had just completed the first volume, and was up to stretch his legs when Glenda phoned just before 10 p.m. He felt surprisingly comfortable as he spoke with her, neither of them giving hints to the other that they were keeping secrets. After he hung up from her call, he wondered if she was finding it as easy to hide her intentions as it was for him. Now that he had made his plans, it was simple for him to do what was necessary. As he thought about it, he wondered if he would ever feel normal again. Before he started Volume 2, he went over his plans once more. On Friday, he would have to take care of more of the details, especially by visiting his bank and making financial arrangements. He had already called Anderson Electric and quit his job, and would have to pick up his final check sometime the next afternoon. It was after 1 o'clock in the morning when he finally finished the second volume. It took him quite a bit longer to read the second book than the first, because he realized that it was entirely possible, even likely, that while he was seated there reading, Glenda was in bed with Anthony in the Sheraton Hotel. His mind kept drifting from the written pages to the disturbing erotic scenes generated by his imagination. By this time, Patrick was very tired, and he finally decided to sleep for a few more hours if he could. He knew that he wouldn't be able to sleep in the bed that he and Glenda had always shared, so once again he stretched out on the sofa. Surprisingly, he was able to drift off to sleep, and eventually woke up at 7 a.m., feeling refreshed. After a quick breakfast, he resumed reading, starting at the beginning of Volume 3. By noon, he had finished the third and fourth volumes, and was able to set the diaries aside while he pursued completion of the items on his to-do list. The first thing he did was visit Anderson Electric to pick up his final check and clear out his locker. The owner, Gus Anderson, tried to convince him to change his mind, as he hated to lose his best worker. Once Patrick had explained a bit of his situation, Gus realized his pleadings would go nowhere, and reluctantly shook Patrick's hand as he wished him the best. He was able to get Patrick's promise to return to Anderson Electric at a future date, if it was possible. His trip to the bank took a little longer, as he had a lot more paperwork to handle. When he was finally able to leave, it was with a cloth bag containing over $20,000, the full extent of what he could remove from the joint and personal accounts held there. He had hoped for a bit more, but additional funds would have required Glenda's signature. The money he was able to withdraw would simply have to meet his immediate needs. It was almost 4 o'clock when he returned home, and the first thing he did was to check his answering machine. There was a message there from Pearsall Investigations, and after steeling himself, he dialed the number for the direct line to John Pearsall. "This is John Pearsall. How can I help you?" "This is Patrick Dunn, returning your call. Were you able to place the cameras, and did you get any results from them?" "Ah, yes, Mr. Dunn. We were able to place the cameras in both rooms yesterday afternoon, and I retrieved the results just afternoon today. Both rooms were vacant when we were there, so it was just a very quick in and out operation." Patrick hesitated before saying, Was there anything much on the tapes?" He almost held his breath as he waited for John Pearsall to reply. "Well, Patrick, it's never easy for me to say this, but your suspicions have been confirmed. I'm sure we'll have all the evidence you're going to need for a divorce action. The two of them spent the night in your wife's room, and there was repeated sexual activity. I transferred the video files to DVD, and it's here for you whenever you want it. You had mentioned wanting 3 stills from the video, and I have them ready to be emailed to you, if you still want that done." John's information had brought tears to Patrick's eyes, something that actually surprised him. Despite everything he had read, knowing that there was visual confirmation available to him somehow moved the whole situation from possible fiction to actual fact. "Yes, please, email me the pictures." "Thank you very much, Mr. Pearsall. If everything is fully paid for, I guess our business is complete." "Yes, your payment covered the account in full. Are you sure you're all right? Your voice sounds somewhat different from yesterday. I know this kind of situation often leads to extreme emotional pain, and truthfully, I'm a little concerned." Patrick had regained control of his emotions, but there was definitely an edge to his voice as he said, "I'm fine. Thank you. I'll be sure to let you know if there is anything else I require." "Well, I'm sure your lawyer will want a copy of this DVD, unless you decide to seek a divorce on grounds other than adultery. In any event, we'll keep it on file for 1 year, or until we get your instructions. You know, there are many of my customers who have told me that therapy can help in situations like this. It's not my area of expertise, but I understand that confirmation like the DVD I have here often takes a toll on the injured party, and that a good therapist can help get you past it all. Please don't concern yourself, Mr. Pearsall. I know what I need to do to get past this. Thank you for your very professional assistance." Patrick hung up the phone before John Pearsall could say anything further. His face was now a mask that hid his emotions, whatever they might be. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when he heard the signal from his computer that mail had arrived. He quietly walked into the room where the computer was kept and opened the email from Pearsall Investigations. After viewing each of the 3 attached photos, he sent each to the printer, which he had loaded with 8 by 10 photo paper. Within a few minutes, he was holding the hard copy evidence of his wife's infidelity. As requested, none of the photos showed explicit activity. The first one showed his wife, naked, facing the camera with her eyes closed while Anthony Romano, also naked, stood partially behind her, his tools clearly visible against Glenda's thigh, apparently kissing her neck. The second photo showed both of them very clearly, and Patrick studied it closely to burn the image of Anthony Romano into his mind. The 2 lovers were each carrying a bath towel, and each was wearing a white cotton robe stenciled with the name of the Sheraton Hotel. Both of their robes were hanging open. Their hair was still wet, and it was obvious that they had had a shower, probably together, Patrick imagined. One of the beds had very obviously been used, with the blankets and top sheet in a bundle on the floor. He may have been imagining it, but Patrick thought he could see a sizable wet spot in the middle of the bed. The third photo showed the 2 of them lying under the top sheet, which was pulled up as far as their waists. Anthony had one hand stretched beneath the sheet in the direction of Glenda's crotch, while he appeared to be whispering in her ear. One of Glenda's hands seemed to be reaching for his tool, and she appeared to be staring right at the camera, a small smile on her face. This photo bothered Patrick the most, and he wished that John Pearsall had substituted an even less graphic photo in its place. The intimacy that it portrayed was sufficient to push Patrick past the point of no return as far as his emotions were concerned. After giving each of the photos a last, lingering examination, Patrick placed all 3 in a brown envelope he had waiting there. He left the envelope on the kitchen table before he returned to the chair in which he had spent most of the last 2 days and picked up the 5th diary. Shortly before midnight, Patrick finished the last 2 volumes of Glenda's diaries. As he sat there thinking back over the entirety of the 6 volumes, he realized how closely Glenda had always conformed to the understanding he had of her. There were very few surprises in the pages of those 6 books. Nowhere did he read anything that suggested she had ever even considered betraying him. He did learn many little secrets about her, all things that helped him understand situations that had arisen in their past. He knew that she was more insecure than he had realized, as many entries in her diary showed how much she lacked in self-confidence. One thing that stood out, though, was her apparent deep love for him. It made her actions with Anthony even more difficult for Patrick to understand. The one true surprise that he discovered was that their meeting at that birthday party so many years ago was not by chance. He learned that when someone had casually mentioned that the guest of honor knew Patrick, Glenda had become excited at the prospect of perhaps being given the opportunity to meet him again. It was at her request that he had been invited to the party, and the rest became history. Reading the 2 volumes had kept him sufficiently occupied that it wasn't until he had finished reading them that he realized that Glenda hadn't called and that he was now very hungry. As he fixed himself a sandwich and soft drink, his mind was fully occupied thinking of Glenda and Anthony replaying their roles from the night before. His thoughts managed to keep his mood extremely dark and reinforced his commitment to the solution he'd already chosen. Whether it was because of the meal he had eaten just before stretching out on the sofa, or the 8 by 10 pictures of Glenda and Anthony that appeared in his mind every time he closed his eyes, he had a very fitful sleep that night. It was just after 7 o'clock in the morning when he gave up trying to get any more rest and got up to start the day he had been preparing for over the previous 2 days. He had a lot to do, and he decided to get an early start. At 8:30 a.m., he made a call to his sole surviving close relative, his brother Samuel. They weren't exactly estranged, but they rarely saw each other beyond the obligatory Christmas visit. It had been only 2 weeks since his brother, sister-in-law Mary, and their 2 children, Sam, who was 12, and Brenda, age 10, had visited. It was obvious to Patrick that his brother was surprised to hear that Patrick intended to drop in that morning for a short visit. Fortunately, Samuel and his family had no other plans. Patrick managed to keep busy until he arrived at his brother's home just after 10 a.m. knowing that the 2 children would be anxious to get back to their activities. Patrick called them into the kitchen, where he was seated at the table with his brother while Mary made a fresh pot of coffee. He knew from their Christmas visit that the family was planning to visit Disney World during the spring break, so he gave each of the children a crisp new $100 bill for spending money. They were excited by the gift and were generous with their thanks and hugs. "You didn't need to do that, Patrick," said Samuel, "but it was very nice of you to make their day like that. What's up? Did you win the Powerball lottery?" Patrick managed a small smile and said, "No, it's nothing like that. My luck has certainly been nothing to brag about. I just felt generous." The three of them sat around the kitchen table with their coffees, engaged in small talk. Finally, Mary said, "I guess there's no need for me to avoid talking about the big plans that you and Glinda have. She told me about how the two of you are going to try to start a family. I know you're going to love having kids around just as much as we do." Patrick was quiet for a few moments before he replied, "She told you about that, did she? I guess there aren't too many things that women don't talk to each other about." Just before Mary was going to say more, Patrick continued, "It's hard to say how our plans will work out. Lots of things can get in the way of decisions like that." He effectively changed the subject when he turned to his brother and asked him a couple of questions about his job as a restaurant manager. A few minutes after the cups of coffee were finished, Patrick stood to leave. "In case I don't see you before next Christmas, I hope everything goes well for you." He gave his brother's hand a quick shake before turning and giving Mary a brief embrace. "I'll be thinking about you." With that brief remark, he turned and left, the three of them exchanging goodbyes as he walked to his car. As Patrick drove away, Samuel turned to Mary and said, "I wonder what that was all about? Something seems to be on his mind, but it didn't look like he was anxious to talk about it." Mary didn't seem to think that there was anything unusual going on as she replied, "Patrick's probably just trying to kill time until Glinda gets back from those courses she signed up for. I seem to remember her saying she'd be gone until tonight." The two of them returned to their home hand in hand as they discussed their plans for the rest of the day. Just before 6 p.m., Glinda Dunn pulled into the driveway of her home. She was a bit surprised to see that Patrick's car was not there and quickly entered the house by the side door into the kitchen. She had rehearsed her first meeting with her husband after returning home and was a bit rattled by the fact that he wasn't there, and only silence returned her call as she entered the kitchen. The fact that she had come home to an empty house wasn't something that she had anticipated. In some ways, she realized that it would be a good thing, as it would allow her to get unpacked and get the clothing in her suitcase into the washing machine. She was already planning to have another shower, unsure that the shower she had had that morning had completely washed away the last traces of Anthony. As she walked past the kitchen table, she noticed a piece of paper in the center of the table, held down with a salt shaker. Realizing that it must be from Patrick, she picked it up. "Glinda, Gus called me from the office this morning. He stuck for a lead hand for a rush job in Centerville, and I agreed to look after it for him. The overtime will be nice. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Patrick." Glinda was mildly displeased with the note, even though it would allow her to accomplish everything that she wanted to do before seeing her husband for the first time after her trip. She set the note on the kitchen counter and took her bag upstairs so that she could get everything into the wash. She had already decided as she walked up the stairs that instead of the shower, she would have a nice, long, hot bath. She transferred the items that she needed to wash into the laundry basket and was carrying it toward the bedroom door when she noticed her diary on top of the tall chest of drawers. She immediately remembered she had left it with her emergency bag on Wednesday and picked it up to take downstairs with her. She was relieved to see that it was where she had left it and that it was undisturbed. She had intended to keep it up to date while on her trip, but had been unable to do so when she discovered that she had forgotten it. She realized where it was when Patrick had told her where the emergency bag was, and she could distinctly remember placing the two items there. Patrick had obviously put the bag back on the shelf, but had left her diary where it was. She decided to bring it up to date while she did the laundry, as it was still a bit early to relax in the tub. While the washing machine removed the last traces of Anthony from her clothing, Glinda prepared herself a sandwich and bowl of soup. When her meal was finished, she put the dirty dishes into the sink and went over to the telephone where she pressed the preset button to call Patrick's cell phone. It rang twice before she realized that the sound of a cell phone ringing was coming from the wicker basket on her kitchen counter. The basket was used by both of them to keep their keys, cell phones, and sometimes even a wallet or spare change. After she hung up the phone, she walked over to the counter and picked up Patrick's cell phone from the basket. "Damn, how am I going to get hold of you now?" It was a strictly rhetorical question, and after asking it, she went back to the kitchen table and pulled her diary in front of her. The small brass key that would open the diary was in her wallet, attached to a piece of red yarn, and she quickly used it to undo the lock. Once the lock was removed, she opened the book to the first blank page, picked up her pen, and began to write. January 7th. Dear Diary, the most eventful 4 days of my life have just ended, and I hope I can remember everything that I wanted to tell you. Some things may be upsetting to put on paper, but I must do it. When I picked up Anthony at his home, it was plain that he was looking forward to this. He kept trying to touch me as we drove, and I was a little put out with him over that. He finally left me alone until we were on the interstate, after I warned him that someone I know might see us. The further we got from town, the more relaxed I became, and I was quite enjoying myself and his attention when we finally got there. I know I can never erase all of the memories, but I'm going to try. Wednesday night, Anthony joined me in my room, and it didn't take him very long. We were quickly naked and having sex. I've already told you how experienced and handsome he is, and he quickly had me fully involved. He has a young man's ability to recover quickly, and we managed to have sex 3 separate times that night before we both agreed it was time to go to sleep. I really enjoyed the sex we shared and came many times. Thursday morning, he woke me up with his tongue. We did it again that morning, just as we did Friday morning. It's something that Patrick and I used to do most mornings when we were first married, and I miss that. If I have anything to say about it, we're going to get back to that. Thursday night was much like the previous night, except that I was now finding myself thinking of Patrick while Anthony was having sex with me. I finally realized after that first night that there is an awful lot of difference between having sex and making love. After we had done it the 3rd time Thursday night, I told Anthony that that was the end of it. The novelty I enjoyed the first night we spent together had rapidly worn off, it seems, and I began to realize how much I preferred making love with my husband. I didn't want to start an argument with Anthony, so I didn't say anything to him until we were preparing to go to sleep. He became quite angry, and for a while there I was actually a little scared of him. Because it was late, we agreed to stop arguing, and both of us went to sleep fairly quickly, although I was already starting to make plans about how I would try to make it up to Patrick for all of this. Friday morning, I woke up and found that Anthony was preparing to have sex with me. I tried to stop him, and I told him that I meant what I said the night before. He didn't listen to me at all and just told me to lie back and enjoy it. When he was finished, he went back into his room, and I locked the connecting door between our rooms. I talked to him through the locked door and told him not to plan on joining me in my room again. He told me that was okay, and that he would find another partner for Friday night. He told me I wasn't the only sexy female sociology professor staying in the hotel. Sure enough, after our closing supper, I saw Anthony with one of the women who had attended a couple of the sessions with me. I know she was married, but she was just as taken in by Anthony as I had been. You can't imagine the relief I felt when I knew that I wouldn't have to argue with him about sex last night. I heard them come into his room, and a few minutes later he knocked at the connecting door to ask for the box of condoms in my nightstand. He didn't give me any problem as I handed them to him. As I lay in my bed last night, I began to realize that Anthony is a predator, selecting older women that he feels he can manipulate. It is to my everlasting shame that I am one of the ones he was able to control. I was afraid that the drive home with him would be a terrible experience, but it actually went quite well. Now that I could see Anthony for what he is, I was able to remain in control of the conversation and our physical interaction. I think he had had enough sex to keep him sated, as he actually behaved quite well. He didn't argue very much at all when I told him that I never wanted to see him again. I think he realized he would have no further control over me. I had a lot of time to think about things as we drove home, and I have already decided that I will make an appointment with a psychiatrist or psychologist on Monday morning. I have to know that I would never again cheat on Patrick, and to do that I think I will need to know how I let Anthony take control of me. I have to do something about that obvious flaw in my character. Whatever allowed this disgraceful episode to occur has to be controlled or eliminated. I'd rather die than give in to temptation like that again. I've also decided to spend the rest of my life making it up to Patrick, even if he will never know the reason why. It is enough that I know this terrible secret. I can only pray that he never finds out. There is one other decision that I've made. If Patrick agrees, I intend to stop taking the pill when my present prescription runs out in 12 days. The prospect of having children has really begun to excite me, and it really makes no sense to wait any longer. When Glenda finished writing her lengthy entry, she used her pen as a bookmark, left the book on the table, and went upstairs to prepare her bath. She brought her cordless phone into the bathroom with her, in case Patrick should call. When the bathtub had filled to the proper level, She added some bath oil, lit some candles, and slipped into the water. As she lay back in the tub, she finally closed her eyes and let the warm water relax her. She was so comfortable that she was on the verge of sleep when she got the feeling that she was being watched. She slowly opened her eyes and turned her head to look back into the bedroom, but there was no one there. She returned to her comfortable relaxation and continued thinking about the ways that she could make it up to Patrick for her foolish relationship with Anthony. An hour later, she returned to the kitchen fully refreshed. After putting her laundry into the dryer, she returned to the kitchen table to reread her latest entry in her diary. She was momentarily confused by the fact that her pen was missing from the book. She was sure that she had left it between the pages, but soon realized she was mistaken when she saw it on the kitchen counter beside the wicker basket. After retrieving her pen, she opened her diary and began to read. Sunday morning, Glenda got up refreshed and eager to begin the next phase of her life. After spending the morning catching up on house cleaning, she had a shower and changed into an outfit that she knew Patrick liked. By mid-afternoon, she was relaxing at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while a large roast was just beginning to cook in the oven, when she was interrupted by a knock at the side door. She was both surprised and alarmed when she saw that there were two large men at the door, one of them a young, uniformed police officer who was standing off to the side with his hand on the butt of the gun holstered at his side. The second man was a bit older, dressed in a suit and topcoat, and was holding up his police identification. "I'm Detective Rankin, and this is Officer Reynolds. We're with the Springfield Police, and we're looking for Patrick Dunn. Can you tell us if he's at home?" The relief on Glenda's face was evident to them, and she quickly said, "Patrick is working right now. The moment I saw you, I was afraid that something had happened to him. I'm his wife, by the way. Maybe I can help you." The two men exchanged a quick glance before the detective said, "Perhaps we should come inside. It's a bit chilly out here." Glenda stepped away from the door and said, "Certainly, come right in." She led the two men into her kitchen before continuing, "Why are you looking for Patrick?" The look of concern came back to her face before she said, "He isn't hurt, is he?" Detective Rankin quickly replied, No, nothing like that. As far as we know, your husband is in good health. We just need to speak with him concerning a case we are working on." "You're certain your husband is away at work?" "Well, of course I'm certain." She walked over to the counter and picked up the note that Patrick had left for her. She handed it to the detective before she continued, "You can read his message yourself. It was waiting for me when I came home from a trip last night." Officer Reynolds had stationed himself by the counter where he could watch the rear entrance, as well as the entire kitchen. He continued to rest his hand on the butt of his weapon. Detective Rankin passed him the note, and when the officer had read the contents, he took it back. "Do you mind if I keep this, Mrs. Dunn?" When she shook her head, the detective opened the zippered case he was carrying and put the note inside. Glenda's curiosity got the best of her, and she nervously asked, "Why do you need to speak to Patrick? What possible interest could the police have in him? He's never been in any trouble." The detective replied, "We received a phone call in the homicide department this morning, reporting a murder. The call was recorded and the number from which it was placed was traced back to your husband's cell phone. We're now working with your husband's cell phone provider to determine where he was when the call was made." Relief washed over Glenda's face as she said, "Well, you have obviously made a mistake somewhere. I tried to reach my husband last night just after I got home, and when I called his cell phone, I discovered he had left it at home. It's in that basket right over there." She was pointing to the wicker basket on the kitchen counter. Skepticism was clearly showing on the detective's face as he said, "Do you mind if I check over his phone?" As he finished speaking, he walked over to the basket, looked at it for a couple of moments before picking it up and returning to the kitchen table with it. "I don't see any cell phone in here, Mrs. Dawn. Are you sure you aren't thinking of some other day and not yesterday?" Shock registered on Glenda's face as she confirmed that the basket was actually empty. She quickly walked over to where the basket had been located and glanced around, although it was obvious that there was nothing else on the counter. "I don't understand. His phone was there when I tried to call him early last evening." She was looking back and forth from the officer to the detective in obvious frustration and concern. "Well, I can't explain why the phone wasn't in the basket where you claim it should have been, Mrs. Dawn. Obviously, I have to believe that the call that was traced to your husband's cell phone really did come from that phone." The detective opened his folder and made several notes before he continued, "Does your husband know a Mr. Anthony Romano?" At the mention of the name, Glenda displayed even more surprise, and her face momentarily lost its color before she said, "I know Anthony Romano, but my husband doesn't. Anthony was my teaching assistant this past semester." The two men exchanged glances again before the detective said, "So there's no reason for your husband to have had it in for Mr. Romano? You're quite certain that he didn't know him?" Linda was beginning to look panic-stricken as she said, "No, Patrick never met Anthony." The detective made more notes before he looked up at her and said, "Well, your husband seems to have known Mr. Romano well enough to have made the call that reported his murder." Glinda was so shocked by the statement that she sat down at the table before saying, "Anthony's dead. He was with me on my trip, and I just dropped him off at his home about 5:30 yesterday afternoon. How can he be dead?" Detective Rankin sat at the opposite end of the table before asking Glinda, "What was your relationship with Mr. Romano? Could it have given your husband cause to murder him?" Glinda's face had gone white as the detective spoke. In a moment, she recovered enough to say, "Anthony was just a senior student who was my teaching assistant, and there was no reason for my husband to do anything to him." Although she had said the words, the tone of her voice was not convincing. The detective let her sit there and fidget for almost half a minute before he said, "When we arrived at the address your husband gave us, we found evidence that Mr. Romano had been attacked as he entered his front door. There was a travel bag lying in the middle of the hallway, and marks that suggest a fight had taken place there. It's apparent that Mr. Romano lost the fight and was dragged into the kitchen where he was tied to a chair with nylon straps, the type that would normally be used for bundling electrical wires together." Glinda had begun to cry softly as he described the scene at Anthony's house. She reached for a tissue as he continued. Before he was dragged into the kitchen, it appears that Mr. Romano was shot in the left knee, and the medical examiner believes a major artery was damaged as there was a lot of blood lost. We haven't received the autopsy results yet. It appears that Mr. Romano was struck several times before he was killed with a single shot to the head. He continued, "The preliminary examination also shows that he was shot once in the groin, a non-fatal injury that appears to most likely have been inflicted post-mortem. The estimated time of death is between 6 and 8 last night." Glinda interrupted him at this point, saying, "Patrick could never do something like that to anyone. He is not like that." Her crying had almost ceased, and it was obvious that she was more angry than upset. The detective consulted his notes again before he continued, "State records show that your husband has a permit for a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. One of the slugs that hit Mr. Romano was recovered from the chair to which he was tied, and our technicians have made a preliminary determination that it was .25 caliber. There is also the question of motive." Detective Rankin searched through his folder and finally withdrew 3 photocopies which he placed on the table in front of Glinda. These are photocopies of 3 photographs that were recovered at the scene. Their placement on the table beside Mr. Romano seems to indicate that he was shown these 3 photographs before his death. Blood spatter indicates they were there when the fatal shot was fired. "I don't think you've been completely honest with me in regard to your relationship with Anthony Romano or your husband's interest in him." Glinda had picked up the 3 photocopies and was looking at them in shock while the detective spoke. As the full realization of what the photos showed sank in, she began to cry in earnest as she said, "No, Patrick couldn't have known." Just as he was about to continue with his description of the crime scene, the detective received a cell phone call. During the 3-minute call, he said very little and spent most of his time writing in his notebook. While he wrote, Glinda had become quieter and now sat with her hands in front of her face as she sobbed. When he finished his notes, the detective looked up at Glinda and said, "Your husband's call was made from Windsor, Ontario. The local police in Windsor have worked with the cell phone company and they found his cell phone. It was in a cloth bag along with his credit cards and the .25 caliber handgun that was registered to him. The bag was in a garbage can in the parking lot of a Walmart superstore. There was no sign of him or his car, although the license plates from his car were also found in the garbage. They believe that he may have stolen a license plate from another vehicle in the parking lot in order to blend into the Ontario traffic." This news was of no consolation to Glinda, and she continued to cry inconsolably as she sat at the table. After watching her for several moments, the detective pulled another photocopy from his folder and placed it in front of her. It was a copy of a photograph of a small brass key, with a ruler placed beside it. There was a small key on top of the photos. "We have no idea of its significance. Do you recognize it?" Glinda took one look at the photograph and immediately grabbed her purse. In seconds, she had removed the diary key from her wallet and was holding it beside the photograph of its twin. It was at that point that she completely lost control and slumped back into her chair. About the only decipherable words that she spoke after that were diary and Patrick. The 2 men stayed with Glinda for almost 15 minutes, waiting for her to calm down. They were finally able to convince her to call someone that could come over to be with her. Once it was confirmed that her sister would be arriving within minutes, the two of them finally left. As they walked back to their cars, Officer Reynolds said, "Do you think they'll apprehend him quickly? It all depends on how well he can hide out for the next couple of weeks. He hasn't committed any crime in Canada, so I don't know how much priority their police will give to searching for him. It's not like he's a serial killer. If he can stay under the radar, the longer he's on the run, the less likely he is to be caught. If he's still out there in 6 months, we may have to request that the case be advertised on TV. Some of those most wanted shows get good results." Officer Reynolds considered that answer for a few seconds before coming up with another question. "What do you think of this cell phone story of hers? It seemed to me that she was serious when she said that the phone was there last night." "Yes, I agree. I don't think she was lying or confused about that. I suspect that he came back here, but for some reason never followed through with his intended actions. While he was here, he probably saw his cell phone and decided on the spur of the moment to take it with him." The uniformed officer seemed a little confused and asked, "Well, if he was here, why wouldn't he have let her know? It seems sort of inexplicable that he would come back and just take the cell phone." Detective Rankin stopped and looked at the younger man and said, "Think about it. Patrick Dunn has just killed her lover, and he comes home. The only reason for coming back that I can think of would be to kill her too, and maybe even himself. I don't know what happened to change his mind, but I don't believe for a second that he just returned for his cell phone." Reynolds slowly nodded his head as he considered the detective's words. Finally, he said, "I expect that Mrs. Dunn will eventually realize just how close she came to losing her life and will wonder why she didn't. I wonder how she's going to handle that." Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.